After decades in opposition, Anwar Ibrahim has become Malaysia's new Prime Minister, but he's the fourth leader in 4 years and faces a strong conservative opposition. So, will Anwar Ibrahim bring political stability to Malaysia? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hazem Sika. Welcome to the programme. A veteran Malaysian politician, Anwar Ibrahim, has been sworn in as Prime Minister. It follows negotiations after last Saturday's election, in which no alliance secured a clear majority. In his long quest for the top job, the 75-year-old led street protests for democratic reforms. He strung together a multi-ethnic coalition while in prison on charges widely seen as politically motivated. Anwar has pledged to fight corruption and focus on the economy, promising to give up his salary as Prime Minister. We'll get to our guests in a moment. First, this report from Florence Louis in Kuala Lumpur.
From heir apparent to opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim's long career in politics has culminated in him being sworn in as Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Saya Anwar bin Ibrahim.
I, Anwar Ibrahim, do solemnly swear to perform my duty as Prime Minister sincerely and to the best of my ability.
Along the way, he was twice imprisoned for sodomy, charges widely seen as politically motivated. His first imprisonment sparked street protests and led to the birth of a reform movement. Upon his release, he united the opposition parties and turned the coalition into a formidable political opponent. He was jailed a second time, 2 years after he led the opposition to its biggest electoral gains in 2013.
Justice will prevail.
Anwar's Alliance of Hope won the largest number of seats in Saturday's elections, but fell short of a majority. His biggest rival is Muhyiddin Yassin, who leads the second largest bloc, made up of a right-wing Malay-centric party and a religiously conservative party. Days of negotiations failed to produce a coalition with majority support. The political impasse was only broken when the King, Al-Sultan Abdullah, appointed Anwar after speaking to several MPs.
This is a national unity government. All are welcome on condition you accept the fundamental rules of good governance, no corruption, and Malaysia for all Malaysians.
Supporters say they welcome Anwar's appointment. The multi-ethnic coalition is seen as more reform-minded and liberal.
I'm happy. We've waited too long for this, and it's time for us to receive someone who can give a better commitment to Malaysia.
Analysts say there will be no honeymoon period for the new government.
He has to put in place a cabinet that conveys credibility and competence. At the same time, he has to probably face a challenge very soon in order to prove that he has majority support in parliament.
His rival, Muhyiddin Yassin, has challenged Anwar to prove his level of support. Muhyiddin has also refused the King's proposal the two sides set up a unity government. Anwar Ibrahim faces challenging weeks and months ahead. He'll have to introduce reforms to fix the economy. He'll also be leading a country where the racial and religious divides appear to have deepened. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur.
Well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In Kuala Lumpur, we have Fahmi Fadzil, a member of the Malaysian Parliament and Chief of Information for Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's People's Justice Party. Joining us from Tokyo, James Chai, a visiting fellow at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute. And in Singapore, we have Meredith Weiss, a professor of political science at the University of New York at Albany. Good to have you all with us. So, Fahmi Fadzil, if I could start with you, is this a coalition that can work? I mean, he's got some tough challenges ahead, hasn't he, Anwar Ibrahim?
Yeah, it's quite a strange bedfellow. I mean, strange menagerie, if you would like to call it that. We were just a few days ago fighting against each other, and now we are in the same government together. I think the circumstances are such in Malaysia, when the king decrees that you form a unity government, most political parties and political leaders will have to follow. I think the only exception is Muhyiddin's party, which has decided to remain in opposition. So right now, we're all listening to the king.
Meredith Weiss, will he be able to unite a seemingly divided nation?
I think so. If nothing else, I think that this is a more stable outcome than if this were indeed a unity government inclusive of Muhyiddin's Perikatan Nasional. So I agree with Fahmi that this is an unusual menagerie of parties, but at the same time, it includes all the major groups within Malaysia to an extent that wouldn't be possible with really any other combination of parties. So hopefully this will indeed be uniting as opposed to more divisive.
James Chai, what's your take on this? Will Anwar Ibrahim be able to navigate this strong strain of Malay nationalism and as well as the return to the religious right?
Yeah, I think what we learned from this election was that there is indeed a rise in terms of conservatism across the country, especially across the northern part of West Malaysia, where Islamic extremism seems to have taken a hold by the search of paths. And what that necessarily means is that the rest of the country looks very polarized and contradictory in terms of what it stakes the future to be. And therefore, having a coalition that consists of different coalitions that are complementary to one another in serving its respective functions seems to be the best recipe to represent race, religion, and region, which is precisely what the king had specified for this government to be formed.
Just taking a step back for a moment, Fahmi, Fadzil, we've had 3 Malaysian prime ministers in the space of 4 years. Why do you think that is? I mean, what's behind the recent history of political instability, do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of it began in 2018 with the end of the hegemony of Barisan Nasional, the National Front that had been in power for 6 decades. Malaysia had never been in a situation where Barisan Nasional, last led by Mr. Najib Razak, who now is languishing in prison, we've never seen any other political party take charge. And as a result, there became a contestation of what was ostensibly to be representatives of the Malays, the so-called majority ethnic group in Malaysia. And that was not sufficiently resolved because UMNO, which is the Barisan Nasional's main component party, was still dominant. Yet Dr. Mahathir, who was leading Pakatan Harapan, with his party Bersatu at that time in 2018, was diminutive, was very small. And as a result, a series of treachery, a series of party hopping began, and then we saw changes of government every 12, 13 months. And it ultimately led to a very untimely demise of the Ismail Sabri administration. And now this is where we are. Essentially, we have the old order collapsing and a new order trying to build itself. So we're in between, kind of like an in-between period.
Meredith Weiss, what does Anwar Ibrahim himself bring to this? I mean, this is the job that he's been trying for much of the last 30 years now, and he's finally there, 75 years old. What can he do now?
Well, I think if nothing else, he brings a desperate desire to be prime minister, which in this circumstance could actually be quite the glue that the coalition needs, in as much as he will do what it takes to make this last. But I do think what is especially warranted at this point is that he take on something of a statesman-like role, which is, I think, actually quite a good fit for him. Leave perhaps some of the issues of policymaking, of ironing out differences to others within his party and his component parties within the coalition, and instead, for himself, really try to be a peacemaker, to represent both a Malay and Islamist side that he historically came to power in his early days with that as his backdrop, but also the same multi-ethnic, fairly progressive, not so conservative bent that his coalition has really championed, starting back in the late 1990s in the Reformasi period, which is when he had left UMNO, not voluntarily, and then really started to champion this new surfacing alternative that has now developed into the contemporary Pakatan Harapan, the Alliance of Hope, as you mentioned.
James Chai, I mean, Meredith touched on the fact that he has this kind of multi-ethnic coalition, but the opposition that he faces is quite strong as well, and it's rooted in this Malay nationalism and conservatism. How hard is it going to be to navigate that as he pursues these policies?
So what Anwar Ibrahim has to do, and I think this is something very clear on his agenda, which is the best way of actually acting against the rise of Malaysian nationalism as well as Islamic extremism, like as we've mentioned before, is to get the fence-sitters who are currently leaning in favor of a more conservative future. And the intersection between that conservatism and poverty is actually cost of living. And therefore, he made it his first agenda of actually addressing cost of living, including asking ministers to asking government civil servants to work overtime, to set up special meetings to actually resolve that issue, because he knows that if he can actually address it and improve the lives of people who are leaning towards the conservative side, he could actually draw them to the fore. The second thing that Anwar Ibrahim would do is that he would adjust the language that he used. And this is something that is quite natural for Anwar Ibrahim to do, which is the things that he say could not appear to be too egalitarian to the point of threatening the positions of Malay Muslims in the country. So drawing that nuanced balance in the center is what Anwar Ibrahim can and would do.
Fahmi, Fadzil, if we take this beyond the domestic politics and all of the various ethnic and religious issues, what is at stake? What is essentially at stake for Malaysians right now? What are the biggest challenges the country faces?
Essentially, it's economic, and some of the most difficult times have come post. We're entering an endemic phase of COVID-19. A lot of people have lost jobs. It's tough on the ground. And I think a lot of people are hoping that this administration does not think of itself as entering a honeymoon period. It's really getting right into the kitchen and really cooking up some solutions for people. Messing up the first 30 days will mean something really significant for ordinary Malaysians, because the price of goods are going up. Ordinary food products like chili, chicken, eggs, it seems to be hard to come by, and they're really expensive. So I think at the end of the day, it's about making sure that there's food on the table for ordinary Malaysians. So Mr. Anwar really has a lot of work ahead, and it's only been a day since he was sworn in. It will take a few more days before I think he sets together the team for his cabinet. We expect probably sometime mid next week. A new cabinet will be formed, if not entirely, perhaps half of the team. But he has given an indication that his primary focus and his main priority will be people's welfare and cost of living.
Yeah, you mentioned inflation there, and inflation is indeed a global problem right now, but those problems are acute in Malaysia. Meredith Weiss, as Fahmi mentioned there really is no honeymoon period, is there, for this government? What are they going to have to do to tackle the economic problems?
Yeah, I agree with everything Fahmi just said. So even if we look at the most recent administration, so you asked earlier about the level of turmoil of the past several years, a lot of that obviously was personality challenges, was the fracturing of the coalition for all sorts of reasons related more to party politics and external factors. But it was also a really difficult time to be governing because of COVID, because of the economic challenges, because of all of that. And so it's not all that surprising that Muhyiddin's government in particular, which came in really as the pandemic started to tick up, then collapsed quite ignominiously fairly quickly after proroguing Parliament for nearly a year. And so in this case, we have a more stable basis coming in. We have this broader coalition. We have an electoral mandate. We have a lot of hope that this can all succeed. But it's a very challenging time to be governing. We're on the cusp of what appears to be a global recession. Inflation is an issue, but other economic concerns also were quite high in voters' minds. So we had, among different vote segments, inflation, jobs, economic development, also anti-corruption is something that relates very closely with inflation or with economic challenges within the Malaysian context. All of these were first and foremost on voters' minds. And so I think Anwar and his coalition will really need to come up with an economic plan to appoint people within the cabinet and within other government bodies who are trustworthy, who are capable, who are not there as mere political appointees, but because they have actual skill and ideas and commitment really and credibly to address these economic challenges head on.
What does all of this mean for Malaysia's place in the world, James Chai? I mean, it was mentioned how Anwar Ibrahim is very much a globalist. What implications does this have for Malaysia's dealings with its neighbours and beyond that?
Yeah, so generally, Anwar Ibrahim, on his first 2 days, reflected his personality and sort of his leadership style that we've seen 20, 30 years ago when he was in government, that he was a very open globalist leader, as you've mentioned. So what that necessarily means is that with neighbors very close to him, like Indonesia, as well as the rest of the Southeast Asian partners, there will be more bilateralism as well as multilateralism that he would pursue. He has also stated his commitment of creating a strong ASEAN region. And that necessarily means that there will be more free flow in terms of trade as well as culture between these nations. And that would necessarily accelerate accelerate the country's economic performance, taking advantage of Indonesia as a starting point. What that also would extend to ultimately is that when you have a strong Southeast Asia, the China-US tensions would also be eased. What Anwar Ibrahim had stated was that he would actively pursue both China and US and economically benefit from both parties, which is what is needed in Southeast Asian countries, not picking one side, but practicing active partnerships with both parties while maintaining neutrality. So I think that would make Southeast Asia a very attractive region with not only huge economic potential, but also strong geopolitical ties.
Fahmi, Fadzil, what do you expect this government to do as far as promoting its place in the region and fostering good relations, as James Chai was saying there, with not just China but also the United States?
Yeah, I think Mr. Anwar is a well-heeled global traveler. I think he has many friends in many places. In fact, yesterday, his very first press conference after being sworn in, I was there. It was quite a wonderfully messy affair because none of the Prime Minister's office staff have been put together, and yet here we are. He got a call from President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So while we're doing this press conference, he gets this call. But that shows, I think, just how the relationships that he has cultivated over the years. I think now is a good time for him to put a lot of those contacts, a lot of that network into action. I think we will be seeing probably Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore made a call this morning, and I think we are in for hopefully better days ahead, where we reset Malaysia's place in the world. I feel as a parliamentarian in Malaysia, perhaps the last two prime ministers, Mr. Muhyiddin and then subsequently Mr. Ismail Sabri, perhaps did not take advantage of international fora, including a United Nations General Assembly speech by Mr. Ismail Sabri, to really reset Malaysia's position in the world. I think Mr. Anwar will quickly course correct on that front.
Is that your view as well, Meredith? You expect a more internationalist approach to Malaysia's foreign policy now?
I do. I mean, Malaysia's foreign policy tends to be highly consistent, so I wouldn't expect any major course corrections or changes. But at the same time, the positioning vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis other partners, we will see minor nuances. But those nuances are important, especially in as much as Malaysia is pulling itself away from and out of the ignominy of the 1MDB scandal, for instance, and it's really trying to find ways to make sure that it maintains export markets and that it brings in investment, and it does all of these other things that allow it to regain its economic footing, given that Malaysia's economy is so highly externally exposed, that this is a country that is so tightly tied within global markets. So any reassurance that Anwar is able to give, and I agree that I think he will be able to give, that this is a country that is on more stable political footing, that is prepared to engage with the world, that is not to be isolationist, and that hopefully will also continue with some of the initiatives of recent years, for instance, toward trying to find a resolution to the conflicts, dire as they are, in Myanmar, that Malaysia has, as in the past, really tried to adopt something of a mediator role within ASEAN. So those sorts of things help to signal Malaysia's stability, its strength, its ambitions as a nation. And so I think all of those are likely to proceed, hopefully in a healthy way, under Anwar's leadership.
James Chai, you see it that way as well, that Malaysia could play more of a mediator role in the region?
Yeah, so I really do think that Southeast Asia would start to play that role, and it's quite an opportune moment as well, because the rest of Southeast Asia are currently turning to more strongman rule, and it's traditionally been the case. So Anwar and perhaps Jokowi, and hopefully a Jokowi successor in Indonesia, could stand as exceptions, carrying both of these worlds, right? One world of being able to cite the Quran, at the same time being able to pursue more modern ideals that seems to progress the region forward. However, I don't necessarily think that they could only play a mediator role. I do think that there is an active role that they could also pursue in the realm of sort of like Islamic extremism, which happens in both Malaysia and Indonesia, and how they actually deal with them internally, as well as externally, providing thought leadership of knowing that there is a reality where actually the values of Islam is actually aligned with modern ideals, is something that also could be espoused internationally, so that there could be guaranteed peace, as well as any prevention of violence and aggression. And I think this is where really Malaysia and Indonesia could take a leadership position.
Fahmi, Fadzil, how do you see this playing out then over the next few months? I mean, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there has been a history of political instability in Malaysia the last few years. I'm assuming that you expect that to change now with Anwar Ibrahim, as given that you're a supporter of his. Why will things be different this time, though?
Today, Mr. Anwar announced that we have a further addition to this unity government. This essentially it's a coalition government, but with a unifying focus, and that puts us almost at a 2/3 majority in parliament in terms of the numbers, in terms of the MPs that support the government. At the same time, he has indicated that parliament will be convened on the 19th of December, and the first order of business will be a vote of confidence, which is rarely done for incoming prime ministers. But because there was some attempt at disparaging the numbers that Mr. Anwar has by Mr. Muhyiddin, Mr. Anwar yesterday announced that the first order of business in parliament will be a vote of confidence. Yeah, so I think this is quite unusual, quite uncommon. And yet, at the same time, I think it's quite brave, and it will put to an end all speculation about problems of instability. I think Mr. Anwar is trying to kill two birds with one stone. One is to quell any form of dissent within the coalition, as well as showing to the world that this government is stable.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to see how this does play out, but we are out of time now. Thanks very much to all three of you, Fahmi, Fadzil, James Chai and Meredith Weiss. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can catch this programme again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the entire team here, thanks for now.